In the last podcast, we looked at how to identify forms of argumentation. In this podcast, we're actually going to look at valid forms of deductive argumentation. The way this works is the form of an argument determines its validity. This means that if an argument form is valid, then any argument having that form will be valid. Of course, that does not mean that any argument having that form will be sound. The first form that we're going to look at is actually represented in our example in the last podcast. The form is, if P then Q, P therefore Q. This form is called affirming the antecedent. Here's the first example. It's premise 1, if I am human, then I am a mammal. Premise 2, I am a human. Conclusion, therefore I am a mammal. This has the same form as the example we looked at in the last podcast. Notice that premise 1 and premise 2 are both true, but that even if they weren't true, this argument would be valid because the conclusion would follow from premises 1 and 2, assuming that they are true. We can see this point clearly in the next example, where one of the premises is actually false. So we have premise 1, if I am a snake, then I am a reptile. Premise 2, I am a snake. Conclusion, therefore I am a reptile. Premise 2 is false, I assure you. But the argument is still valid because, assuming that premises 1 and 2 are true, the conclusion would be guaranteed to follow. The second valid form of inference is what's called denying the consequent. This one is very similar to affirming the antecedent, but with a slight difference. So we have premise 1, if P then Q. Premise 2, not Q. Conclusion, not P. We can see this form in the example. Premise 1, if I am a snake, then I am a reptile. Premise 2, I am not a reptile. Conclusion, therefore I am not a snake. Premises 1 and 2 are both true. The conclusion must be true. Third form of valid inference is called disjunctive syllogism. So premise 1 is P or Q. Premise 2 is not P, or in some instances not Q. And the conclusion would follow Q, or the conclusion of P would follow if premise 2 were actually not Q. Example of this seen here. Premise 1, either I go to the party or I stay home. Premise 2, I don't stay home. So it's denying the second part of the first premise. Conclusion, therefore I go to the party. The last valid form of inference is what's called hypothetical syllogism. It's called a hypothetical syllogism because the form of statement that we've already been dealing with, if blank then blank, is called a hypothetical statement. So here we have premise 1, if P then Q. Premise 2, if Q then R. Conclusion, if P then R. Notice here that what's happening is Q is actually being taken out since this was playing kind of the role of the middleman. An example here is premise 1, if I am a human, then I am a mammal. Premise 2, if I am a mammal, then I am warm-blooded. Conclusion, if I am a human, then I am warm-blooded. The statement, I am a mammal, is taken out of the middle there. So if premises 1 and 2 are both true, the conclusion has to follow. Conclusion then. Remember, we are only asking whether the argument is valid here when we consider the argument's form. Once we determine that it's valid, we still have to ask whether it's sound, which means we still have to ask whether the premises of the argument are true. But any argument in any of these forms will be valid. Our task then will be to determine whether the premises are actually true.